Alright, I have been to some extent paying attention to the Syrian conflict for years and years now, and with it becoming a much more globally relevant conflict and situation in the last couple of days, couple of weeks, I thought I would make a video going over the 10 main groups you need to be concerned with if you want to discuss the Syrian conflict in a broad sense. So I'm going to try to roll through these pretty quickly and go over who the groups are and really the Western and U.S. relations with those groups so you can understand how we view the conflict. Okay? Perfect. First group would be Assad. Okay, now Assad, Bashar al-Assad was the leader of Syria. His father, I think Hafez al-Assad, had taken over the country. They had ruled the country for 50 years. They were part of a group called the Alawite, which is a religious minority that exists largely in this area. They're a sect of Islam, but Bashar al-Assad had run a brutal dictatorship as a leader of the minority group. The Sunni Muslims, as well as some like terrorist groups and some groups wanting democracy, led a protest in 2011 called the Arab Spring. That protest, Assad cracked down on that protest with violence, and so that kind of led to the beginning of the Syrian civil war in 2011. Over the next handful of years, over the next 5 or 10 years, there was a lot of violence and there was a lot of fighting in the Syrian civil war. And by, the 2020 or so, the violence and fighting had largely reached a standstill. And Assad had controlled really kind of this part of the country of Syria. Now, this might seem like not that much of Syria, right, in terms of territory, but this is like most of the people. Most of the people either live here over in the coastal region or over here in Aleppo, over here in the capital, Damascus. So they had controlled most of the people, and it had been not stable per se, but the front lines had not been changing until the last couple of weeks. Assad actually went to Russia to ask them for support, and as a result of him kind of like losing ground in this war, and Russia basically said no. The big reason there is that Russia has their own stuff they're dealing with. So Assad has left the country. He was kind of the person everybody was not necessarily unified, but everybody was definitely fighting against for a long time. And so he was a big power player, and he is not anymore. In terms of our U.S. and kind of Western view, I'd give him like 0 stars out of 5. We really did not like Assad. He's used chemical weapons on his own people, and not only was he terrible towards his own people, but he also did not support U.S. interests, and he was a close ally with people like Russia and Iran and Vladimir Putin and the ruling party in Iran. So we really did not like Assad. Okay, so that's your first player. Your second player would be the rebel groups. Now, this is a broad coalition of rebel groups here that largely exist in the northern part of the nation of Syria. They were largely up here in kind of this region for a long time. And it really started, the original group that a lot of people were familiar with was the FSA, was the Free Syrian Army. What happened during the protests in 2011 was a part of the Syrian army defected and became the Free Syrian Army. The United States backed them and helped them out. Okay, they've largely kind of gone by the wayside in favor of other rebel groups. And the current rebel group that some people would call a terrorist group, some people would call a rebel group, would be HTS. Okay, HTS is a rebel group that has some ties to Islamic terrorism. Sometimes we'll call them an Islamic terrorist group. Sometimes we'll call them an Islamist group. Sometimes we will just call them rebels. Okay, it's very complicated. But the way, just to give you a little bit more context about them, their current leader is a guy named Abu Muhammad al-Jalani. Abu Muhammad al-Jalani was a member of Al-Qaeda, so he has that background. But he has also tried to distance HTS from Al-Qaeda and from those connections and tried to soften their image and make them seem a little bit more hospitable to things like minorities having rights, as well as kind of Western influence. So that's currently what's going on with their group. They actually were the ones who caused the takeover, so they kind of moved south into this Homs area, and then they were able to move on the capital and take over the country from Assad. So they don't control the whole country. They don't even control maybe a majority country, but they're probably the largest player on the ground at this point. Okay, so HTS, in terms of the U.S. support, now they're not Assad, and so we give them credit there because they're at least not explicitly against U.S. interests. They do have backgrounds with terrorism, so we do have some concerns. We'd maybe give like the U.S.-Western alliance with them maybe like 1 star out of 5. We don't necessarily hate them as much as Assad, but we're certainly not huge fans. Okay? But I think a lot of people in the West are optimistic that they will do the things that they say in terms of respecting minority rights. So one big thing is they've gone into this area that we said was largely an Alawite minority area, and the Alawites led by Assad had been taking away the rights of the rest of the people in Syria. So there were a lot of concerns that when the Sunnis in the rest of Syria took over the country, they would punish the Alawites and kind of look for retribution by carrying out war crimes against the Alawite citizens. It doesn't seem like they are doing that yet. That's not a guarantee that they will not, but it seems like at this point, HTS is respecting the Alawite people in Western Syria, which is a good thing if you are Alawite or a outside observer, or HTS if you're trying to protect your public image, or really just anybody who doesn't want to see people die. Okay, the third main group on the ground would be this group in the south, or in the southern part. This would be known as the Southern Operations Room. They have influence kind of in southern parts of Syria. Now, they kind of were laying dormant for a long time, but with the recent action, they've stepped up and they have taken over some territory. They've become a larger player. They are kind of a confusing coalition of groups. They're not nearly as big as kind of the groups working in the northern part of Syria. They consist of a religious minority called the Druze, which kind of have their own complicated history, but they're a religious minority that lives down here in Syria. There are also Christians in this area. There are also Sunni Muslims who are associated with the Southern Operations Room. But basically, this is a group that, because of some of their kind of religious views and just kind of how they view the world, they're not necessarily as prone to carrying out like terrorist attacks and stuff. Now, they don't have as much influence, but most in the West are a little bit more sympathetic towards these groups than maybe the groups up in the North. So maybe we'd give them like 3 stars out of 5 in terms of Western support. Okay, then the fourth group we're concerned with is the Kurds. Now, the Kurds are a group of people, okay, that should have their own country in a lot of people's view, called Kurdistan. Okay, the Kurds live in this area, but the reason you've never heard of Kurdistan is because they do not have a country. Okay, they live up here in northwestern Syria. They also live in areas like Turkey and Iraq, which will come up later. Okay, they have for a long time they had influence over kind of this region. Since the violence over the last couple of weeks, they have taken over kind of like this region, and so they do have a lot of influence on the ground. Notably, the United States is closely allied with them, mostly because we wanted to use them to fight against ISIS, and so that's largely where the U.S. relationship with the Kurds has come from. But we also do support them in some senses. If you're looking at maps, sometimes they will be labeled as the SDF. That just means Syrian Democratic Force. Now, this is not like a traditional Western style democracy idea, but they're a little bit more sympathetic to Western ideas than many other groups on the ground. That being said, they've also carried terrorist attacks out in Turkey and against other groups, and they worked with Assad for a while to fight against other groups that they didn't like. So not exactly like the peak of groups we could support in terms of they're not perfect, right? But and they certainly have their flaws. Maybe they'd be like 2 or 3 stars out of 5 in terms of Western support. Okay, the fifth group we need to talk about is SNA. The SNA up there stands for Syrian National Army. Now, when you see Syrian National Army, you just need to think one thing. This is Turkey. Turkey saw this violence happening on their border, and they were like, hey, we need to be involved with that. Now, Turkey, technically speaking, is a U.S. ally. They are a member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is led by the United States, which feels weird to say. They're kind of the black sheep of the NATO alliance, and so we have a lot of concern over them, especially their leader, who's a guy named President Erdogan, and he's done a lot of not very democratic, not very nice things towards a lot of groups of people. Yeah, and so he, during the chaos, kind of wanted to use the Syrian National Army to grow his influence. So Syrian National Army has influence over here and over here, kind of along Turkey's border, and so they have been working in the chaos to take over more regions and grow Turkey's influence. The big point of contention with Turkey is they really don't like the Kurds. So they've been moving in kind of to this Kurd-controlled area, and so the Kurds have been fighting back against them in there. So one of the big points of fighting has been the Kurds against the Turkish-backed forces over here in the northern part of Syria. overall, I mean, they are supported by Turkey, so they're not necessarily the worst group in the area, but they're definitely not a group that the United States would be likely to support. Maybe we'd give them like 1 star out of 5 as well, the Syrian National Army and the Turkey-backed groups. Okay, the 6th player would be ISIS. Now, if you don't remember ISIS is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. You can see Iraq over here. That's where ISIS started. That's where the Islamic State started. And then they kind of moved into Syria during the chaos in the early days of the Syrian Civil War. And then the United States really fought back hard against ISIS with the support of some other groups, and we really use the Kurds to do this. And so ISIS does have some pockets of support over here in the rural regions, but largely they lay dormant. We've done a lot to fight against ISIS and crush their support now. That being said, one of the biggest points of U.S. involvement is that we have prisons over here where the Kurds are, and in those prisons there are former ISIS members and current ISIS members, and we are really concerned that those ISIS members are going to be able to get free and go get influence in the country of Syria and in the country of Iraq, and then be able to carry out terrorist operations. And so one of the big points of interest for the United States is making sure we keep those prisons with the members of ISIS secure. Okay, in terms of the U.S. and Western support ISIS, we get like a -5 stars out of 5. We really hate ISIS. Obviously, they've carried out a lot of terrorist attacks, and so they're not anywhere close to anything being aligned with the West. The last group kind of on the ground involved at all would be Syria. Okay, or I'm sorry, not Syria. The last group involved in Syria would be Israel. So you can see Israel down here shares a border in a short area with Syria. And so this is an area called the Golan Heights. Israel has a lot of concerns over this area, and so they've moved into it. And then with the violence going on currently in Syria and the chaos, they want to kind of control their own border, so they've moved troops into this area. In addition, Israel has concerns about terrorist groups getting access to chemical weapons and nuclear facilities and stuff like that, so they've been carrying out bombing raids and missile strikes on some other areas within, especially southern Syria, but other parts of Syria as well. Okay, your view on Israel's involvement in this conflict is largely going to be based on your view of Israel in their own conflict against Palestine and Hamas and stuff. So if you support Israel in that conflict, you probably really support Israel in their role in Syria. And if you don't like Israel in their conflict with Palestine, you are probably thinking that they should stay out of this. Overall, though, they don't really want to take over Syria. They just want to keep their border safe and then make sure that no terrorist groups get access to Bashar al-Assad's chemical weapons. So in terms of U.S. and Western support, we give them like 3 stars, and we're pretty supportive of what they're going to do, but also we have concerns about Israel's respect for human rights, and that's been a big concern with the war in Israel. Okay, to briefly go through the other power players, which would be the other countries, would be 3 main countries. First one would be Russia. Now, Russia's big alliance was with Assad. Okay, Russia wanted to have access to warm water ports here on this is the Mediterranean coast, and so they have 2 big naval bases over here. Now, those 2 naval bases still exist. Okay, the rebels didn't go in and try to wreck shop against the Russians. That would be a silly thing to do. That'd be really would not be a good idea for the Syrian groups, but they were closely aligned with Bashar al-Assad, and they had supported Bashar al-Assad in the civil war. Now Russia obviously has their own war with Ukraine going on, so they weren't able to offer Assad the same level of support that they had done before, and so that's a big reason why Assad fell. Okay, within Russia's role now, they're kind of trying to broker some influence within HTS, within the Turkish groups, the Syrian National Army. They just kind of want to have a hand in Syria, and they have of the outside powers, they'd probably have the most influence within the country of Syria, and so they just want a seat at the table so that they can continue to have access to warm water ports in the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, obviously a geopolitical foe of the United States, but Vladimir Putin is trying to grow his influence within Syria, or at least maintain some level of influence within Syria during this chaotic time. Okay, second outside country would be Iran. Now, Iran, some people are calling them the biggest losers in this conflict, other than Assad. They had worked somewhat with the Assad group. Now, Iran is the biggest Shia Muslim group. Most of Syria and most Muslims are Sunni Muslims, and so Iran really was supportive of Bashar al-Assad just because he wasn't Sunni, he was Alawite, and so Iran worked with them a lot, and with Assad falling, Iran was supportive of them, and with Assad kind of his regime really falling apart, weakening, and then falling apart, their influence over this region has weakened. The big reason that Iran wants to have influence over Syria is because they want to be able to send their weapons into Lebanon, their weapons and influence into Lebanon, so that they can work with a group called Hezbollah to fight against Israel. Okay, that's the big reason that Iran wants influence in this region. But it doesn't seem like a lot of these groups are going to be very close allies with Iran, mostly because some of these groups know that if they are close allies with Iran, then that will lessen their support from places like the United States and Israel. So especially groups like the Kurds and the Southern Operations Room, those groups are going to be a little bit more distrustful of Iran. And then obviously the rebels up in the north are going to be a little bit distrustful of Iran just because of the Sunni-Shia split that kind of occurs in the Middle East. So they are not particularly happy in Iran with the results of what's going down. The last outside observer would be the United States. Now, the United States does not have the level of influence as Iran and Russia in this region. The big concern of the United States was supporting the Kurds in their fight against ISIS, and so we're going to certainly continue to do that. And American military officials have gone out and talked about how they're going to maintain the ISIS members that are in prison over in the Kurds-controlled area of Syria during this chaotic time. The only other thing I would say about the United States is they're probably going to try to broker support within HTS and try to advocate for some sort of constitutional democratic transition government in Syria and try to be supportive of that. We don't have the same level of influence as Russia in this area of the world, especially in Syria, but we're going to probably do what we can. I would be very surprised if there was any sort of boots on the ground, any sort of military support in any major way other than sending weapons and stuff to the Kurds, but they're definitely going to be looking and seeing if they can offer diplomatic support to the groups who want to set up democracies and to the groups that are sympathetic to the United States, like potentially HTS, like the Free Syrian Army, and like the Southern Operations Room, and like the Kurds. Okay, so those are your 10 biggest power players within Syria in this chaotic scene. As you can tell, this is chaos. This is not a civil war like I always compare it to the American Civil War. Okay, in the American Civil War, you have the North, who are the good guys, and the South, who are the bad guys. In the Syrian Civil War, there's no good guys and bad guys. Okay, you might think, oh, the Kurds are the good guys, but they've carried out terrorist attacks in Turkey. You might think, oh, the rebels are the good guys, but HTS has pass with terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. Okay, and so they're far from any sort of good guys. The Southern Operations Room, maybe we're a little bit more sympathetic to them, but they're not as big, they're not as strong, they don't have as much influence. Israel, we obviously have concerns about human rights abuses over here. We're obviously not closely aligned with Russia. We really hated Assad, okay? But at times, the Kurds had worked with Assad to fight against Turkey, right? And so, we definitely don't like Iran. We really are not supportive of these Turkish groups, but also they're not quite as bad, and Turkey is a U.S. ally. So if you can't tell with all these lines going around, this is a very, very confusing situation. Okay, it's a complicated situation, and what we need to do is we need to certainly celebrate the toppling of Bashar al-Assad. I think for most Americans, we would agree that that is a good thing, both for American interests and hopefully for the Syrians living in the nation, in Syria. But we also need to be cautious and to be hesitant to make any rash judgments toward any of these groups. All right, so that's kind of my take in following this conflict and trying to simplify some of the complex stuff that has gone on within Syria. Let me know which groups you think the United States should support, and let me know what you feel about the Syrian conflict in the comments down below. Thanks for watching.